There is no right or wrong direction in which to do our hatching and cross-hatching lines. The question to ask is what will create the effect that will best suit this particular drawing? But three excellent principles are: what will reflect the underlying form of the object that the cross-hatching is being applied to? What will create the visual separation of these different forms? And what will create the values, the lights and the darks that will best suit the overall visual impact of my drawing? When we start learning to draw, it's vital to understand that learning to draw is actually a skill that we're learning, and the same principles that apply to learning any skill and learning it well apply to drawing. It's not some magic special category. Don't get distracted with the thought of talent. Realize that the same sort of consistency, learning principles, and effort is going to be necessary. When I draw a straight line, I should keep my attention on where I want the line to end, not on where the pen or pencil end is as it travels. I focus on where I want the line to end, and then intuitively I bring my arm movement in a way that will bring the point to that end point. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that time spent watching how to draw videos on YouTube, or spent buying drawing supplies or reorganizing drawing supplies, is the same as actually drawing. There is no substitute and no shortcut to put in the time and effort into drawing. So don't do other things that distract us from actually picking up our pen or pencil or brush or whatever. When we draw from a photo, our aim shouldn't be to make an accurate copy of the photo. We should ask, how can we improve on this scene with the possibilities that whatever medium we're using will give us? Don't fear making mistakes when you learn to draw. Mistakes are a natural part of any learning process. And remember, they actually focus our attention on where we need to put more effort, more work. And because of that, we should think of mistakes as our drawing friends and use them fully. When I'm drawing scenes that particularly have architectural perspective, I should recognize the fact that these angles get steeper and steeper as they move up above the eye level, which gives us a horizontal line across the whole scene. Is perfectionism a problem for you? Fear of making mistakes can become such a paralyzing concern that it actually can stop us from even starting to draw or finishing our drawings. In my experience, stopping using pencil and therefore being able to use an eraser was the key thing in punching through this. Being able to erase lines that aren't quite right is the oxygen that perfectionism needs to survive. If we remove the possibility of being able to use an eraser by drawing directly in ink, while that presents some challenges that we have to overcome, it actually makes perfectionism, or it did for me, impossible to exist, and opened the door for a wonderful new freedom and confidence in drawing. It's very helpful at the start to learn to draw in a way that creates a sense of depth. This way, we can add a great sense of realism to any scene that stretches back into the distance. When you finish a drawing, don't rush on to the next one. Always stop, look at the drawing that's been done, preferably when it's just been finished, and ask, what's worked well, what hasn't worked well? When we critique our drawings at the end, we're not criticizing ourselves. We're taking the opportunity to work out, how can I focus on the next drawing, either with things to try and do again, or perhaps mistakes, things that haven't worked that I need to avoid. It's critiquing at the end that gives us this incredibly important focus for our next drawing. When we have a scene where certain objects sit in front of other objects behind, it's important to draw the closest ones first so that we don't end up running lines through different objects. We get a nice sense of separation, and we also get a strong sense of things being in front of other things adding to the sense of depth that we've otherwise created. Don't just pick up a pen. We should choose our drawing instruments with intention. Particularly pens, different widths of pens create different effects. A thinner pen creates a very different effect to the same drawing with a thicker line. Using pens of different widths or different colours in the one drawing can introduce more possibilities for the effects we create. It's not so much what pen should I use as what pen or pens will create the best effects for what I'm wanting to produce in my drawing. Most of the time, it's not helpful to try and draw individual leaves. Instead, we need to look for the overall form of the tree canopy, the way it moves in and out, usually indicated by lights and darks, and capture that more generalized effect. What we really want to avoid doing is developing a type of leaf pattern that we draw over foliage, regardless of the light or the type of tree that it is. Try and avoid drawing for as long as it takes to finish the drawing. Have a time frame in mind, whether it's 30 or 90 minutes. Having a set time helps us create a certain rhythm, a certain tempo in our drawing, which can be tremendously helpful in creating a rhythm, a tempo, which then flows on into a consistency of technique and drawing style. Don't worry too much about the materials you use. In fact, the best art materials to use when we're beginning are the ones that we can find easily and afford easily, ones that we can afford to waste. Nothing's going to hamper our drawing improvement as much as being afraid of wasting our drawing materials and therefore becoming less confident, more cautious, more careful in what we do. We need to be free to experiment, free to make mistakes. If you're drawing with a pencil underdrawing, and this can be a great way to draw, and I've done it a lot myself, but avoid doing the pencil outline and then basically tracing over the top of it with the pen. Use the outline as a guide, but even with the pen on top, still refer to the reference photo for the pen lines. That way we get to improve even on our pencil underdrawing, whereas tracing on top can create a very stiff wooden effect. I should avoid trying to do a heavy outline with flat hatching. This creates a very two-dimensional, flat appearance. Rather, I need to think about how can I do edges and hatching that will create a three-dimensional form that captures a far stronger sense of realism. A lot of the problems I see with beginner drawings is that the person who's drawn them hasn't realized that the sort of observation we need to make of our reference in order to draw it well is very different to the sort of observation that's perfectly adequate for everyday life. And therefore, what we've observed isn't enough to actually draw on to confidently and accurately create the scene that we want to create from it. Being on the lookout for subjects that we can draw, for photos that we can use as references all through our week, is a tremendously useful thing to do. It means that when we actually sit down for a drawing session, we're not losing time trying to find scenes that we can draw. And if we choose the exact one beforehand, we can already even have done some thinking about how we might draw this particular subject. Many drawing problems are caused by rushing to start to draw before we're actually ready. It's not just before we've observed all the things we need to observe, but we haven't really worked out our strategy for how we're going to draw, where we're going to start, how we're going to progress the drawing, what effects we want to create in different parts, and what we want, most importantly, the overall visual impact of the drawing to be. These are the things that guide and help us decide how to do our drawing. And it's far easier if we work them out, at least as a starting point, before we put any mark on our paper. When we draw trees, it's often far more effective to draw the tree canopies in first and then to join them up with branches that combine and meet in the trunk at the ground. That way, it's far easier to proportion the branches and the trunk for the overall size of the tree more accurately. When we start at the ground and work up, it's very easy to end up with a trunk and with branches that are too thick for where they disappear into the canopy and then the space there is until the edge of the canopy. I think it's tremendously helpful when we're learning to draw if we avoid copying other people's drawings. When we copy, we learn the copying skill, which is a very different one to learning to create our own original drawings. The problem is we can get a better looking drawing far more easily copying, and that can make it very tempting to do. But if we want to be able to create our own drawings, it takes us off as a distraction to the side. It won't help us get to where we're wanting to go. When we draw, we should rush to avoid doing heavy outlines, even when the subject is relatively straight-edged. Often a hard, sharp, continuous line doesn't create the sort of effect that our particular subject would have us capture for a sense of realism. If my learning to draw is a self-taught journey, then I need to be the teacher as well as the student. I need to do all the things that a teacher would do in a course, in a school setting, in a class. Most importantly, I need to choose the content, what I choose to do carefully and appropriately, and I need to mark my work afterwards. Give myself comments that I can then use to help me in the next thing I'm doing. Generally, perspective is not as difficult as its reputation would often make it seem. The problem is that so many perspective videos present the subject in a way that's way more suitable for architects than it is for artists. The information is way insufficient for what artists need to know to be able to apply it in the real life situations that they see. But the problem is, it's way too easy to think that we're the problem and not to realize that the problem is in the presentation that we're seeing. If this is a problem for you, please check out my perspective playlists. When we're presented with overwhelming detail, we shouldn't try to draw all the detail, but rather taking the overall effect of what we're seeing and seek to create that effect, particularly paying attention to values and how we can use hatching to create the effect that we're seeing, particularly when it's in nature. When drawing buildings, it's helpful to avoid the temptation simply to leave behind the glass as either just bare white or to colour every pane of glass in with a black fill. Far better to see what the actual effects in our reference are and how we can capture those effects for this particular subject, these particular windows, in this particular light, in our drawing. Value, and by value we mean the lights and darks in any given scene, are an incredible tool for manipulating the way a scene looks. We can use it not just to create colour and shadows, but we can exaggerate in order to bring clarity to our scene, and particularly to push things forward by having darker values behind. When drawing buildings, we should avoid the temptation to rush and draw a heavy, solid line where the building hits the ground. This is seldom a way of creating a realistic effect, and it doesn't allow us to at least suggest all of the detail that often happens at ground level as various architectural elements visually meet the ground in slightly different places. Creating a sense of three dimensions can't happen very easily if we've rushed to draw a heavy straight line. I might like drawing a certain subject over and over again, and there are a lot of benefits when we're learning to draw in doing this. But equally, changing our subject and stretching out of our comfort zone is also a great way to force ourselves to work on our technique and not to get into ruts and, if you like, even stereotypes of the way in which we draw. Changing up our subjects is a great way of keeping the way we approach drawing fresh and with some animation in the marks that we use. We often think of creating drawings by using lines, and some subjects particularly lend themselves to this, but I have found it's far more helpful to think of creating drawings through using marks. When we're thinking marks rather than lines, it opens us up to far greater variety of putting the ink, the graphite, the charcoal onto the paper. With a lot of different marks that can be combined in different ways, we can work at creating a far greater variety of effects and capture whatever our subject is in whatever conditions we're viewing it in.